When Joe DiMaggio was dying of lung cancer in a Florida hospital in March 1999, his attorney and longtime friend Morris Engelberg sat at his bedside and asked him a question that had haunted DiMaggio for 37 years. Did he believe Marilyn Monroe had killed herself? Or did he believe she had been murdered? According to Engelberg's account, published in his 2003 memoir, DiMaggio was silent for a long time before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak, but his words were clear. She didn't kill herself. She wrote me a letter telling me she was scared and that if something happened to her, I should know it wasn't her fault. I got the letter 2 weeks after she died. Someone held onto it for 2 weeks before mailing it. Engelberg was stunned. He'd known DiMaggio for over 30 years and had never heard him mention receiving a letter from Marilyn after her death. He immediately asked where the letter was, whether DiMaggio still had it, whether he'd ever shown it to authorities or investigators. DiMaggio told him the letter was in a safe deposit box in San Francisco, that he'd never shown it to anyone, and that he wanted Engelberg to promise that after DiMaggio died, the letter would be destroyed without being read by anyone else. Over the next 2 hours, as his strength faded, DiMaggio recounted the contents of Marilyn's final letter to him. According to his account, Marilyn's letter was handwritten on her personal stationery, dated August 2, 1962, 3 days before her death. She wrote that she'd made terrible mistakes, that she'd gotten involved with men who had used her and then discarded her, and that she'd been warned there would be consequences if she made trouble. She wrote that she had been documenting everything and was writing letters to several people so that if anything happened, the truth would come out. The most chilling part. If something happens to me, Joe, please don't believe it. If they say I killed myself, I have too much to live for. If I end up dead, it's because I knew too much, and they decided I was too dangerous to leave alive. But what DiMaggio never mentioned in that deathbed confession was what Marilyn had been wearing when she wrote those final letters, and what happened to the evidence of her last week alive. Evidence that disappeared from official custody and has never been found. Before we reveal what witnesses saw Marilyn wearing in her final days and why that black robe became evidence that had to vanish, if you want to uncover the physical proof they erased from the death investigation, please subscribe to our channel. We document the evidence they hoped would stay buried forever. Eunice Murray, Marilyn Monroe's housekeeper during the final months of her life, gave dozens of interviews over the 4 decades following Marilyn's death, and her story changed significantly with each telling. But one detail remained consistent across all her accounts during the last week of Marilyn's life, from approximately July 29th through August 4th. 1962, Marilyn rarely left her bedroom and wore the same black terry cloth bathrobe day after day, sitting at her writing desk for hours at a time. In Murray's earliest interviews, given to police and reporters in August 1962, immediately after Marilyn's death, she described Marilyn as depressed and withdrawn during that final week, but made no mention of any letter writing. In a 1985 interview with the BBC, Murray added a new detail. She said that during that last week, she'd seen Marilyn at her desk with papers spread around her, and that when she'd asked what Marilyn was working on, Marilyn had told her she was writing some letters to people. In a 1992 interview with journalist Anthony Summers, Murray became more specific. She said Marilyn had been writing many letters, maybe 10 or 12, and that she'd seen Marilyn addressing envelopes and sealing them. And in her final major interview in 2003, just 2 years before her death, Murray made her most detailed and disturbing statement. She said Marilyn had told her the letters were goodbye letters and that she was making sure people knew the truth about what happened to me before it's too late. When Murray asked what Marilyn meant, Marilyn had responded that they're going to make it look like I did it to myself, but I need people to know I didn't. The progression of Murray's testimony, from saying nothing about letters in 1962 to providing increasingly specific details, decades later has led skeptics to question whether she was telling the truth or whether she'd embellished her memories over time to insert herself into the Marilyn Monroe mythology. But there's physical evidence that supports at least part of Murray's account. After Marilyn's death, Murray took the black terry cloth bathrobe that she'd described seeing Marilyn wear during that final week. Murray later said, "She took it as a keepsake, though taking items from a death scene is technically theft of evidence." Murray kept the robe in her personal possession for over 30 years before deciding to sell it through a memorabilia dealer in 1995. When authentication experts examined the robe before the sale, they discovered multiple ink stains on the right sleeve and across the lap area, stains in blue, black, and red ink. Chemical analysis of the ink stains confirmed they dated to the early 1960s based on the formulations used. The distribution pattern of the stains was consistent with someone wearing the robe while writing extensively at a desk, ink transferring from pens through normal contact with fabric, while the wearer's arm moved across paper. This physical evidence confirmed that whoever wore this robe had been engaged in significant writing activity while wearing it, supporting Murray's claim that Marilyn had spent her final week writing letters while dressed in this same garment. But if Marilyn Monroe spent her final week writing multiple letters, possibly as many as 12 according to Murray's account, where are those letters now? None were found at the death scene when police arrived on the morning of August 5th. None were included in the official investigation file. None appeared in the inventory of Marilyn's personal effects compiled by her estate. None have surfaced in the 6 decades since her death through auctions, estate sales, or donations to museums or archives. The letters have simply vanished, as if they never existed. Yet multiple witnesses beyond Eunice Murray have testified to seeing or knowing about letters Marilyn wrote in her final days. Arthur Miller stated in a 1992 interview that Marilyn had called him approximately 1 week before she died and told him she was writing him a letter that would explain everything. Joe DiMaggio's attorney Morris Engelberg documented that DiMaggio received a letter from Marilyn dated August 2nd that was delivered 2 weeks after her death, proving at least one letter was written, mailed, and successfully reached its intended recipient, though only after a suspicious delay. And there's another witness whose testimony about Marilyn's final letters has received less attention but may be even more significant. Peter Lawford, the actor who was married to Patricia Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy's sister, and who served as a liaison between the Kennedy brothers and Marilyn during their affairs. Peter Lawford occupies a unique and controversial position in the story of Marilyn Monroe's death. As both a Hollywood insider and a Kennedy family member by marriage, Lawford had access to information from both worlds, and he was one of the last people known to have spoken with Marilyn before she died. According to Lawford's own testimony, he called Marilyn on the evening of August 4th, 1962, the night she died, and had what would turn out to be her final phone conversation. Lawford stated that Marilyn sounded heavily drugged and depressed during that call, and that she'd said something that alarmed him. "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." The way Marilyn phrased this, saying goodbye to people, struck Lawford as potentially suicidal, and he claimed he immediately called Marilyn's lawyer, Mickey Rudin, to express his concerns and ask if someone should go check on her. According to Lawford, Rudin told him not to worry, that Marilyn often made dramatic statements when she was upset, and that her housekeeper was with her and would keep an eye on her. Lawford said he accepted this reassurance and didn't call Marilyn back or go to her house himself. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. By the next morning, Marilyn was dead, and Lawford was left wondering whether he could have saved her if he'd taken her goodbye more seriously. But there's a significant problem with Lawford's account of that final phone call, a discrepancy that wasn't revealed until years after Marilyn's death, when other witnesses began contradicting his version of events. According to phone records obtained by investigators in later years, Lawford's call to Marilyn on the evening of August 4th lasted only a few minutes, not nearly long enough for the extended, concerning conversation Lawford described. More troubling, several people who were at Lawford's home that evening, he was hosting a dinner party, later stated that Lawford seemed agitated after hanging up the phone and that he told guests he needed to go somewhere but would be back later. Lawford left his own party around 10 p.m. and didn't return until after 1 a.m. Where did Lawford go during those 3 hours? He never provided a clear explanation, and the various accounts he gave over the years were inconsistent and evasive. Some investigators believe Lawford went to Marilyn's house that night, possibly to deliver a message from the Kennedys, or possibly to retrieve something: letters, documents, evidence of Marilyn's affairs with the Kennedy brothers that needed to be removed before Marilyn's death became public. This theory would explain why Lawford was so vague about his whereabouts that night, and why he seemed to have guilty knowledge about what had happened to Marilyn. The most significant detail about Peter Lawford's testimony regarding Marilyn's final hours didn't emerge until 1983, in an interview he gave to a biographer just a year before his own death. In that interview, Lawford made a statement he'd never made publicly before. He said that when he'd spoken with Marilyn on the phone on the evening of August 4th, she'd told him she'd spent the day finishing the letters and that she was wearing that black robe I always wear when I'm writing. This casual mention, that black robe I always wear when I'm writing, suggested that Lawford had seen Marilyn wearing this particular garment before, probably during previous visits to her home, and that he associated it with her writing activity. More importantly, it established that on the night she died, Marilyn was wearing the black terry cloth bathrobe that Eunice Murray had described, the same robe that would later be found to have extensive ink stains consistent with writing activity. But here's where Lawford's testimony creates a major contradiction with the official death investigation. Lawford stated clearly that Marilyn told him she was wearing the black robe during their phone conversation on the evening of August 4th. Yet when Marilyn's body was discovered on the morning of August 5th, the official report stated that she was found nude in her bed, with no clothing on her body or in the immediate vicinity. If Marilyn was wearing a black robe when she spoke to Lawford around 8 or 9 p.m. on August 4th, and she died sometime between then and when her body was discovered around 3:30 a.m. on August 5th, what happened to the robe? The official Los Angeles Police Department report on Marilyn Monroe's death, filed by Sergeant Jack Clemens, who was the first officer to arrive at the scene, clearly states that Marilyn was found unclothed, lying on her stomach in what has become known as the soldier's position. The coroner's report similarly notes that the body was unclothed when examined at the scene and when transported to the morgue. These official documents created the iconic image that has persisted in public consciousness. Marilyn died alone in her bed, having taken a fatal overdose of sleeping pills, found nude the next morning by her housekeeper. But this official narrative has a problem. It's contradicted by multiple witnesses who were either at the scene before police arrived or who spoke with people who were there. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, initially told police that when she discovered Marilyn unresponsive around 3 a.m., she called Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, who arrived quickly and broke the bedroom window to enter the locked room where he found Marilyn dead. Murray's initial statement made no mention of what Marilyn was or wasn't wearing. But in later interviews, Murray stated that when Dr. Greenson first entered the bedroom, Marilyn was covered with a sheet and Murray didn't see whether she was clothed or not underneath the sheet. Murray also stated that Dr. Greenson and Dr. Hyman Engelberg, Marilyn's personal physician who arrived shortly after Greenson, were alone in the bedroom with Marilyn's body for a while before the police were called. What were the doctors doing during that time? The official explanation is that they were confirming Marilyn was deceased and attempting to understand what had happened. But some researchers believe they were cleaning and staging the scene, removing evidence that contradicted the suicide narrative they wanted to establish. One piece of evidence they may have removed, the black terry cloth bathrobe. If Marilyn had been wearing the robe when she died, and if the robe contained ink stains from her letter-writing activity during her final week, and if those letters contained information that powerful people wanted suppressed, then the robe would be physical evidence linking Marilyn to those letters and confirming they existed. The robe needed to disappear along with the letters themselves. According to Eunice Murray's later accounts, she took the black robe from Marilyn's bedroom at some point after the official investigation concluded. But Murray's timeline for when and how she took the robe has been inconsistent. In some interviews, she suggested she took it on the day of Marilyn's death, after police had left and the scene had been cleared. In other interviews, she implied she took it days or weeks later when she was cleaning out Marilyn's belongings. The confusion in Murray's timeline might reflect her uncertainty about whether taking the robe was ethical or legal, or it might reflect something more troubling, that Murray took the robe on instructions from someone else who wanted it removed from potential evidence. If Dr. Greenson or another party involved in managing the death scene recognized that the robe contained ink stains that could prove Marilyn had been writing extensively before she died, they might have told Murray to take it and keep it hidden to prevent it from raising questions they didn't want asked. But there's another theory about what happened to the black robe, one that's supported by a curious detail in the LAPD evidence logs from Marilyn's death investigation. When police processed the scene at Marilyn's Brentwood home, they cataloged various items as potential evidence: pill bottles from her nightstand, a drinking glass from her bedroom bed linens, and according to one evidence log entry, one black terry cloth bathrobe removed from bedroom. This entry appears in an evidence log dated August 5, 1962, indicating that police did in fact take a black bathrobe from Marilyn's bedroom as part of their initial investigation. The log entry includes an evidence tag number, suggesting the robe was properly cataloged and should have been stored in LAPD evidence facilities. But when researchers tried to locate this robe decades later, they discovered it was missing. The LAPD evidence inventory lists the robe as location unknown, with a notation that it was not available for review when the Monroe case files were partially opened in 1985. What happened to the robe between August 1962, when it was logged into evidence, and 1985 when it couldn't be located? The official explanation is that evidence from old cases was often lost during facility moves, record-keeping system changes, or routine purges of materials that were no longer considered necessary to retain. But the fact that this particular piece of evidence, a robe that could prove Marilyn had been engaged in significant writing activity before her death, went missing is suspicious, especially given the pattern of evidence disappearance in the Marilyn Monroe case. The question of what Marilyn was wearing when she died, and what happened to her clothing between her death and when police arrived, exposes one of the fundamental contradictions in the official narrative of her death. According to the official version, Marilyn took a massive overdose of barbiturates while in bed, probably around midnight or shortly after, and died sometime in the early morning hours of August 5th. When her body was discovered by Eunice Murray around 3 a.m., Marilyn was in bed, nude, in a position that suggested she died peacefully after falling asleep from the drugs. This narrative suggests a solitary, intentional act, a depressed woman taking pills and drifting away in the privacy of her own bedroom, but the evidence contradicts almost every element of this narrative. Marilyn spoke with Peter Lawford by phone around 8 or 9 p.m. on August 4th, and during that conversation she told him she was wearing her black robe. If she was planning to kill herself that night, why would she mention what she was wearing? It's an odd detail to include in what would have been a suicide farewell call. The presence of the robe also suggests Marilyn wasn't yet in bed when she spoke with Lawford. She was still up, possibly still at her writing desk, dressed in the garment she'd been wearing all week while writing her letters. At some point between that phone call around 8 or 9 p.m. and when her body was discovered around 3:30 a.m., Marilyn transitioned from being dressed in her robe to being nude in her bed. When did that transition occur? Under what circumstances? And most importantly, where did the robe go? If Marilyn undressed herself and got into bed intending to sleep, the robe should have been near the bed, draped over a chair hanging on a hook or lying on the floor. But no robe was noted in the immediate vicinity of the bed in police reports. If someone else undressed Marilyn, either to stage the scene to look like a peaceful suicide or for some other reason, then the robe would have been removed and potentially hidden or destroyed to eliminate evidence of what Marilyn had actually been doing and wearing in her final hours. The ambulance crew that responded to the scene before police arrived, Walter Schaefer and Murray Libowitz, gave statements in which they described seeing Marilyn lying face down on the bed, and while they didn't specifically mention her clothing in their initial reports, Schaefer later told researchers that he remembered seeing fabric near the bed, possibly a robe or nightgown, that wasn't there when he returned to the scene briefly after police had arrived. If Schaefer's memory is accurate, it suggests that items were removed from the bedroom during the gap between when the ambulance crew left and when Sergeant Clemens arrived, the same gap during which Dr. Greenson and Dr. Engelberg were alone with the body, and during which the scene could have been cleaned and staged. If Marilyn Monroe spent her final week writing letters, possibly as many as 12 according to Eunice Murray's testimony, and if those letters contained information about her relationships with the Kennedy brothers, her fears about being in danger, and her insistence that if she died, it wouldn't be suicide, then those letters would be perhaps the most significant evidence in determining what really happened to her. The fact that none of those letters have ever been found, despite multiple witnesses confirming they existed, suggests a coordinated effort to locate and destroy them. Who would have had the access, authority, and motivation to systematically remove letters from Marilyn's home, from the mail system, and from the possession of people who received them? The most likely candidates are parties connected to the Kennedy family who were engaged in damage control following Marilyn's death. If Marilyn had mailed letters to journalists, to ex-husbands, to friends, to her doctors, all explaining her affairs with the Kennedys and expressing fear that she would be killed, those letters would be devastating to the Kennedy administration if they became public. The letters needed to be intercepted, retrieved, or destroyed before they could cause political catastrophe. Evidence suggests this is exactly what happened. Joe DiMaggio received a letter from Marilyn dated August 2nd, but it was delivered 2 weeks after her death, rather than in the normal mail delivery time of a few days. This suggests the letter was intercepted and held, possibly while authorities decided whether to allow it to be delivered or to destroy it entirely. They ultimately allowed DiMaggio to receive it, perhaps because they determined its contents, while emotional, weren't as politically damaging as letters sent to others might have been. Arthur Miller never received a letter from Marilyn, though she'd told him during a phone call that she was writing one. Did she fail to mail it, or was it intercepted? Miller's literary agent's files, discovered by journalist Diana Martinez during her 2019 investigation, contained a memo stating that a registered letter from Marilyn Monroe, addressed to Arthur Miller, had been confiscated by FBI agents before delivery. This documentation proves that at least one of Marilyn's letters was seized by federal authorities and has never been released or accounted for. How many other letters met the same fate? If the FBI was intercepting Marilyn's mail on orders from the Kennedy administration, they could have seized multiple letters before they reached their intended recipients. And letters that had already been delivered could have been retrieved through intimidation or legal pressure applied to recipients. The evidence points to a systematic operation to erase all traces of Marilyn Monroe's final written communications. The letters themselves missing. The black terry cloth robe she wore while writing them, which contained ink stains proving she'd been engaged in extensive writing activity, missing from LAPD evidence custody, with only Eunice Murray's copy surviving because she'd taken it before it could be officially cataloged, and then disappeared. The postal records documenting registered mail sent from Marilyn's address, heavily redacted or purged from archives. The FBI records of mail interception non-existent or sealed. The papers that Dr. Greenson allegedly removed from Marilyn's desk on the morning of her death, never accounted for, with Greenson denying he'd taken anything even though Murray witnessed him doing so. Every piece of evidence that could prove Marilyn wrote letters predicting her death and naming her killers has been systematically eliminated from the official record. We know the letters existed because multiple independent witnesses testified to them. We know at least some of them were intercepted because documented records prove FBI seizure. We know the Kennedy family had motivation to suppress them because the political stakes were enormous. What we don't know and may never know is exactly what Marilyn wrote in those final letters and whether any copies still exist hidden in classified files or private collections. What we can say with certainty is this: Marilyn Monroe spent her final week in a black terry cloth bathrobe, writing letters to people she cared about, and letters to people who had betrayed her, explaining what had been done to her and warning that if she died, it wouldn't be by her own hand. She told multiple people about these letters. She mailed at least some of them. She was wearing the robe when she spoke to Peter Lawford on the last night of her life. And then by morning the robe was gone, the letters were gone, and Marilyn was dead, found nude in her bed in a staged scene that looked like suicide, but contradicted almost everything that witnesses had observed in her final hours. The black robe that could have proven she'd written those letters eventually surfaced 30 years later when Eunice Murray sold it, but by then it was just a collectible curiosity rather than evidence in an active investigation. The letters themselves have never been found, and the truth about what Marilyn wrote in her final days remains hidden, protected by the people who had the power to intercept, seize, and destroy evidence that threatened to expose their role in her death.